Well, still to come on the show, we'll be hearing from the head of Ofsted. Plus, I've spoken to people on both sides of the heated debate about HS2. But first, for 3 years, Northern Ireland was without a devolved government. But after a deal brokered by the UK and Irish governments, an executive and assembly was reformed 3 weeks ago. We're joined now by the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster. Thank you very much for being on the programme, Ms Foster. Well, we're now officially out of the European Union. We heard a little earlier from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, being pretty clear that the government wants to diverge from the EU. Are you worried that this could mean more checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK?
Well, good morning, Sophie. Yes, we have left the European Union, but unfortunately for those of us who live in Northern Ireland, we are going to be still the subject to single market regulations. And it's important now for us to get clarity on what that actually means for us in Northern Ireland in relation to future trade deals and indeed what's going to happen when goods are coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, because of course we rely heavily on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. I think about 70% of all the goods that come over into Northern Ireland come from Great Britain. And of course we're concerned about that. We worry about the fact that it might reduce our choice in terms of consumer choice in Northern Ireland. We're worried about price and the fact that it may put up prices in Northern Ireland. And of course the very fundamental issue of having checks internally within a country is of great concern to me as a unionist.
I mean, Boris Johnson said that there won't be checks, but of course, if he does really want to diverge from the EU to the extent that we're led to believe, it's quite hard to see how that could happen. I mean, do you trust Boris Johnson on this?
Well, we've heard Boris Johnson say this right throughout the issue. He told one of my colleagues in the House of Commons that emphatically there would not be checks. But it's difficult to see how that is the case, given that we've heard from other members of the Cabinet that they intend to diverge away from single market regulations, whilst Northern Ireland remains within the single market. It's difficult to see how that's going to work. But we're in Northern Ireland now working through what's called the Joint Ministerial Council, where we meet with colleagues from Scotland and Wales and from the Westminster Government to try and work through all of these matters, because it is a huge issue for us, not just in Northern Ireland, but of course will have impacts in Scotland and Wales as well, and in England, in terms of their ports, what's going to happen there when the goods are coming over from Great Britain into Northern Ireland.
I mean, Boris Johnson's talking a lot about sovereignty at the moment. Are you worried that he's preparing to kind of sell out Northern Ireland in order to get what he wants when it comes to sovereignty? I
mean, it's one of the issues why I supported Brexit sovereignty, the fact that we could have control over our border, our laws and our money again in the United Kingdom. It's the key reason actually why I supported leaving the European Union. So for those of us in Northern Ireland, it's very important that that sovereignty runs as well into this part of the UK. It's important that we are still in the United Kingdom's customs code. Of course, that's the fundamental difference between Theresa May's deal and Boris Johnson's deal. But the issue then arises around these single market regulations and how they're going to impact our trade from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And that's what we want to see clarity on in the coming months.
OK, now power sharing is, of course, back up and running in Northern Ireland. Why do you think it took so long to get to this point?
Well, that's a very good question. For our part, we were always prepared to go back into government again. And I suppose we could spend the rest of the interview talking about what happened over this past 3 years. But for me, it's important that we look forward, that we deal with all of the challenges that we have, because we haven't had a government here for 3 years. Principally, those arise in our National Health Service, the fact that we have the longest waiting lists anywhere in the United Kingdom. And we need to deal with those issues and to focus on what we have in front of us instead of looking backwards.
I mean, the deal that restored power sharing also included this promise by the Westminster Government to implement something called the Stormont House Agreement. Now, that's an agreement from 2014 where the government commits to setting up this historical investigations unit to investigate deaths during the Troubles. Are you worried that this could mean fresh investigations into British troops?
Well, I think the Stormont House Agreement is 5 years old now, nearly 6 years old. It's important that we look at all of the consultation responses that came in from various victims groups to see what they want. And I think we need to revisit the Stormont House Agreement, because what is being proposed, and we made this clear in our consultation response at the time, What is being proposed is not acceptable, I think, to the victims groups here, and it's certainly not acceptable to us. So there needs to be a re-look at the Stormont House Agreement, particularly in relation to the remit of the historical institution, the HIU, which is there to look at historical cases.
Do you think the UK government is perhaps underestimating how serious this could potentially be?
No, I think they're very much aware of how serious this issue is. This is a legacy issue from 1998 in the Belfast Agreement. Victims were not treated well in the Belfast Agreement. That was left as an open wound. We now have been left with nearly 22 years later. We're still dealing with these issues. There is a need to deal with these issues. I absolutely agree with that, but it has to be done in a way that recognises fairness and recognises what actually happened here in Northern Ireland over 35, 40 years. The fact that we did have a terrorist campaign and there were so many innocent victims as a result of that.
I mean, Boris Johnson said he will end vexatious claims. Do you trust him that he'll be able to do that?
Well, I hope that he will be able to do that, but I hope that he does it in a way that recognises not just soldiers and British soldiers who live on the mainland, but also he takes into account those people who continue to live here in Northern Ireland. Security force members who continue to live here in Northern Ireland need to be protected as well from vexatious claims. I think that is very important. So we will be continuing the conversation with government about legacy issues. We'll be continuing the conversation, obviously, in the executive about these issues as well, now that the executive is back. But as I say, this is a running sore that runs from 1998, and it's something that does need to be sorted out.
Now, we've been talking, of course, about the devolved government, the restoration of that in Northern Ireland. And, of course, the executive collapsed in part because of this renewable energy scheme, where businesses were encouraged to switch to renewable energy, but it actually ended up wasting £500 million of taxpayers' money. Is it right that 3 years later you're back as First Minister? Are you sorry?
Well, of course, there is a public inquiry which hasn't yet come to the fore. That public inquiry will bring forward a report, and we will learn and adapt from that public inquiry report. I think it's important that we do learn the lessons from that area. But, you know, at the time that the executive collapsed, there were wild and frenzied allegations around about a number of people. I think it's important that we have the report from the public inquiry, which will deal with all of those issues, and we look forward to that coming in the near future.
£500 million, a lot of money, though. Are you not sorry?
Well, it's not. Actually, we're on an underspend situation in relation to the renewable heat incentive scheme, because we took, I mean, when people talk about £500,000, that was the projected figure if we hadn't have intervened and dealt with the issue. We did deal with the issue, and now there isn't an overspend. In fact, there is an underspend in relation to this scheme. So I think when people throw about those sorts of figures, they really need to look at the facts. The fact was that was a projected amount of money. That's now not going to happen. And in fact, we're in an underspend situation with the Westminster government.
OK, now we're going to be looking at HS2 a little bit later in the programme. Boris Johnson's been promising some big infrastructure spending. One of the ideas that he did moot once was this idea of a bridge linking Northern Ireland to the UK mainland. Is that something that you'd like him to be considering? Well,
I think it is important that we look at infrastructure projects and not only look at them, but actually look at how they're delivered. And one of the difficulties with HS2 is the fact that it has overran spectacularly. And that's not unusual, unfortunately, with infrastructure projects. And there's a need to look at how those are delivered right across the United Kingdom. But if we are to look at rebalancing the United Kingdom economy, because, of course, there are only 3 regions of the UK economy which are net contributors to the economy, and those are all in one part of the UK down in the southeast in London. If we are to rebalance the economy across the United Kingdom, then there needs to be interventions, and one of those interventions is to have better infrastructure. So I support the government in putting money into infrastructure, but it has to be done in a way that we get value for money, and it has to be done in a way that it is project managed in the correct fashion. So do you like the idea of a bridge then? Well, I think it should be scoped out. I think we should be ambitious in relation to all of our infrastructure projects. I don't think it's the complete priority for the Northern Ireland Executive, if I'm entirely honest, but I think that we should look at ambitious projects, because in the past, when we had ambitious projects, those were the ones that made the difference, if you like, to our economy. OK, Arlene Foster, thank you very much for coming on the programme this morning. Thank you. Thank you.